So I'd like to join David in thanking everybody for bringing us all together today. The exhibition is spectacular, and the ability to think about it and think about the issues that it raises and the excitement last night of being able to see the works together is a very, very special experience. In 1930, Noguchi chose to study Gowa, or Chinese national painting, with one of its greatest exponents, and in so doing he became a participant in a vital and extraordinarily complex exchange of artistic vocabularies between artists in China and the United States, going back to the 18th century, as David Clark has just noted. This exhibition and this symposium are dedicated to the notion that Noguchi's experimentation with the artistic vocabularies of artists in China in the 1930s is, I quote, far more complex and unpredictable, end quote, than can be understood within the over-determined binary framework with which we are most familiar in both the West and the East, which have tended to describe such exchanges. As David also noted, standalone histories of either Western or Chinese art are deeply flawed. They are also deeply biased. Experimentation with non-Indigenous artistic vocabularies by Western artists, such as Van Gogh or Picasso, are today described in the East as well as in the West as innovative, inventive, and revolutionary accomplishments. Painterly experiments by Western-style modernists in China in the same period are, however, often considered, even in China today, as little more than imitations of Western painting, with true modernism in Chinese art often being described as beginning in the 1970s. Yet another assumption that pervades popular perceptions in the West is that Chinese national painting, Gowa, represents a pure and unchanged ancient tradition. And as the distinguished scholar Lang Xiaojun so eloquently describes in his essay for the catalogue to this exhibition, this assumption is equally false. Lang points out that Shibashi was first awarded international recognition in Japan when his work was introduced in an important binational exchange, the second Sino-Japanese joint painting exhibition, which took place in 1922 in Tokyo. And in his autobiography, Shibashi acknowledged that much of his success in the Tokyo exhibition could be attributed to the encouragement of a fellow artist who had advised him to change his painting style. In noting this, Lang Xiaojun reminds us not only of the rich experimentation in Chinese national painting in the 20th century, but also of, I quote again, the complex and unpredictable exchanges between artistic vocabularies in China and Japan at this time, the interpretation of which has remained as politically sensitive today as it was in the 1930s. Important for our discussion today is also to note that Noguchi arrived in China at a time of virulent debates among intellectuals and artists as to whether the aesthetic heritage of classical China was a viable resource for those artists and intellectuals who wished to enter the modern, but simultaneously resist cultural invasion and domination by the West. Many Chinese intellectuals and artists had, however, at this time turned away from classical traditions and instead embraced Western models as a source of inspiration. Among them was this gentleman, the renowned writer and revolutionary Lu Xun, who had been appointed in 1912 to the Social Education Office of the newly formed Republic as head of the section for Art, Culture and Science, and the introduction of the study of Western art into the curriculum and Lu Xun's proclamation of the social function of art in 1912 unleashed polemic discussions lasting until today regarding the role of Western art in the reform and modernization of Chinese culture and of its national painting traditions. In October 1930, as Noguchi was studying the intricacies of Chinese national painting in Beijing, Lu Xun presented an exhibition of German, Russian, and French woodblock prints at a union hall in the Japanese concession of Shanghai that attracted more than 400 guests in 2 days. The prints in the exhibition were from the writer's own superb collection of expressionist European and American graphic art by artists such as we see here, Kubin, Archipenko, and Feininger. Lu Xun's collection, rich in depictions of urban dystopia and of the disenfranchised and dispossessed by artists such as George Grosz here on the left, Heckel, Kollwitz, and Pechstein, had been acquired with the assistance of a Chinese scholar who studied art history, literature, and philosophy in Berlin and Heidelberg between 1929 and 1932. And the woodcuts that were sent from this scholar from Germany to Lu Xun portrayed distress, anxiety, and the alienation of a continent that was soon to fall under the sway of Nazi dictatorship and the scourge of a second brutal global war. In August 1931, Lu Xun began lecturing on the history of both Japanese and German expressionist woodcuts and initiated a woodcut training class at Shanghai's renowned Uchiyama bookstore, which served as a place of exchange for Chinese and Japanese intellectuals, artists, and writers. And among these writers was Noguchi's father, the renowned poet and writer of fiction, Yoni Noguchi. In another of the complex and unpredictable complications of the period is the fact that although the woodcut had been invented in China 1,000 years earlier, the cosmopolitan and political subjects, such as we see here on the right-hand side by Li Hua, that was favored by the woodcut movement that emerged in China in the 1930s under the tutelage of Lu Xun, was considered to be, by their practitioners, both Western and modern. Here we see some more images from the woodcut movement. And here we see works by artists in China demonstrating very clearly, this is 1936, demonstrating very clearly their awareness of the emergence of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, and predicting the impending Second World War. Here we see the call to the Chinese people to rise to the defense of China. The act of seeking inspiration from outside one's own cultural milieu, as exemplified by the artists of Lu Xun's woodcut movement and by both Noguchi and Lu Xun, was described by Lu Xun as Grabbism in a 1925 essay titled Upon Seeing a Mirror. He defined Grabbism as borrowing with confidence, like a master who chooses freely according to his needs, and not like a neurotic who fears the loss of indigenous tradition or enslavement by what is borrowed. Professor Shu-mei, a scholar of comparative literature at UCLA, noted that this confidence of the individual writer as a global citizen who can freely borrow without the anxiety of cultural contamination or subjugation is what grounds Lu Xin's resolute search for new techniques, end quote. David Clark made an important observation today regarding the reception of Chitwa's artistic exchanges or borrowings or Grabbism in Guangzhou and in London in the 18th century. It was, he noted, without a spectacle of his Chineseness, at least with respect to his art. In 20th century Europe, important exhibitions of contemporary Chinese art, curated by leading Chinese artists, were often discussed, on the other hand, in terms of their Chineseness and in terms of the Chineseness of the works of art on display. This, we see on the left here, the catalogue of the first exhibition of modern Chinese art in Europe after the overthrow of China's last imperial dynasty in 1911. This exhibition, which took place in Strasbourg in 1924, included art by Chinese Grabbists who had borrowed freely from Western traditions without fearing the loss of indigenous tradition or enslavement. Their intercultural experiments were, however, apparently met with a cool response. The response to the decorative arts presented in the Chinese section of the International Exposition of Modern Industrial and Decorative Arts in Paris in 1925 was also cool. The section was described in the guide to the exposition as indicating, I quote, that Chinese art was incapable of reform or modernity. A quote here, while political and social life in China clearly seems to be in turmoil, the splendors of its hieratic and distant art thus far hardly leave room for new approaches. Artist curator Liu Haisu, who organized a number of the most important exhibitions of contemporary Chinese painting in Europe at the time, insisted in 1931 that only those works, and I quote, which express their own cultural character, end quote, should be included in exhibitions of modern Chinese painting in Europe. Any indication of what he called superficial westernization, which in his opinion applied to Japanese modern painting, was to be avoided. Ironically, Liu Haisu was an enthusiastic Grabbist and a leading exponent of Shiwa or Chinese Western style painting. This desire, however, in the 1930s on the part of Chinese artist curators to present in Europe only those paintings which depicted Chineseness, even those artist curators who themselves were practitioners of and advocates for Chinese, Western style painting, must be seen in the light of a competition between Japan and China for recognition and prestige in an increasingly militarized and nationalistic Europe. Liu Haisu would note in his reports back to China that Japanese culture and yoga, or Japanese Western style painting, was held in high regard in Europe. A prestigious exhibition of Chinese contemporary painting curated by Liu Haisu in 1934, that's the catalogue to it on the right-hand side, traveled in various forms to Berlin, Hamburg, Dusseldorf, Amsterdam, The Hague, Geneva, Bern, and London. Only Gowa, or national ink painting, were chosen for the exhibition, and among them were works by the famous master from Beijing, Shu-mei. This exhibition enjoyed the highest level of official support from Adolf Hitler's year-old government and was a resounding success in Berlin with 13,000 visitors. Its honorary committee included the German Reichsminister for Foreign Affairs and the German ambassador to China, Dr. Oskar P. Trautmann, a collector of Chinese contemporary art and one of the most active collectors of the paintings of Shu-mei. In the exhibition catalogue, it was noted, quote, "From the German side, the wish was expressed to see pure Chinese works, and indeed especially those that express what is characteristic of Chinese painting," end quote. This desire on the part of the Nazi regime to promote pure and characteristic Chinese works must be seen in the context of stormtroopers searching the home of Lionel Feininger, the German-American artist so admired by Lu Xun, 1 year earlier in March of 1933, and the first exhibition of degenerate art in Dresden, Germany, in September 1933. Little known is the fact that one of the earliest international protests against the mishandling of academics, intellectuals, and artists in Nazi Germany took place on June 3rd, 1933, in Shanghai, where a letter of protest from the China League for Civil Rights was signed, among others, by Lu Xun. It was responded to by the German government denying the allegations, and this letter came from the ambassador Oskar P. Trautmann, the collector of Shu-mei. Another major exhibition of Chinese art in Europe was co-curated by the leading Chinese artist curator Xu Baihong. It opened at the Jeu de Paume in Paris from May to June 1933, here we see it on the left-hand side, and traveled to Milan, Frankfurt, Moscow, and Leningrad. Of special interest to us today is that the artist Teng Baiye, whom David Clark just introduced to us, was included in this exhibition with a work titled Pan. In his preface to the catalogue to the Paris exhibition, the distinguished writer Paul Valéry noted that, quote, "Europe for a very long time, contented itself with viewing the art of the Chinese as nothing more than curiosities, bizarre inventions, monstrosities, more or less ingenious and precious," end quote. Valéry eloquently described the condition of the contemporary Chinese artist in the 1930s as one of broken traditions and nouveautés in all domains. I quote, "an environment of ruins and a crisis of innovation." Valéry wrote of the recent exposure of Chinese artists to the, quote, "ensemble of European art and, quote, the possession of two paths, theirs and ours. It is," he adds, "the resolution of a profound dissonance rather than the result of difference, nothing less than two ways of seeing." Indeed, Teng Baiye's exposure to the ensemble of Euro-Western art and Noguchi's exposure to Chinese national painting occurred in the context of broken traditions and nouveautés in all domains, in both the West and the East. Each artist therefore possessed two paths, theirs and ours, in a resolution of a profound dissonance rather than the result of difference. A last exhibition to be graced by official representation from both China and Nazi Germany took place in Berlin from May to June 1937, only weeks before Japan attacked China. Under the auspices of the Society for East Asian Art and the National Gallery in Berlin, the exhibition presented 67 contemporary Chinese paintings belonging to the German ambassador to China, Oscar P. Trautmann. And as noted earlier, Trautmann was a collector of Chinese contemporary art, especially the paintings of Shi, who was represented in this particular exhibition by 3 works. Also among the artists in this exhibition was Tobey, here on the left, in a dedication to Mark Tobey, with 6 paintings, of which one, an undated finger painting, was titled The Demon Slayer Chung Kui, here on the right-hand side. As David noted in his presentation today, Teng studied and taught at the University of Washington in Seattle, and in an interview with the Seattle Star in 1927, Teng was quoted as saying, "People will soon tire of this too realistic age and turn to Oriental art." Here on the left, we see one of the very few paintings by Tobey that has survived from the period. And on the right, Northwest Still Life by Mark Tobey. In the spring of 1931, while Noguchi sought the Orient in Japan, Tobey moved from the United States to China, where he took up an appointment as head of the Department of Fine Arts at Yenching University in Beijing, an institution that was closely associated with Harvard University, where Teng had also apparently studied. 2 years later, in an extensive article in Art on Modern China, Teng wrote of the turmoil, poverty, war, and military exploitation that he found on his return to China, and what he called the mystery of the extraordinary richness of cultural life in Beijing at that time. He attributed it to, I quote, "the victory of idealism in the age and the life and death struggle on the part of Chinese artists." It was in this rich cultural life of Beijing that Noguchi would find a city and a people to whom he would remain deeply attached. In 1937, in the New York World Telegram, he acknowledged, quote, "an everlasting debt to China." Like Noguchi, Mark Tobey immersed himself in the rich cosmopolitan life of China when he visited his friend, as David Clark noted earlier, in May of 1934. "China is sky climbing," the young American artist observed. On May 12, 1934, Tobey commented in his diary on a spectacular performance by the renowned Peking opera star Lin Fang, an acquaintance of Shi in Beijing. I quote, "The lack of realism is seen as a higher expression of emotion." A few weeks later, in June 1934, Tobey would follow in the footsteps of Noguchi when he too traveled to Japan to study poetry and calligraphy. It's instructive to compare the work of Tobey and Noguchi in the period immediately following their retrospective sojourns in China. Noguchi's drawings from Beijing made during his studies with Shi are distinguished by both the presence and absence of realism and by an emphasis on the human body. Broad and fine ink brushstrokes delineate or mask underlying figures or reduce them to align. The volume and mass, so common to Western art, are erased or overlaid by the lineal. In his essay in the present publication, Lang Xiaojun makes a provocative assertion regarding the drawings of Noguchi during this period. He does not believe that Noguchi sought to imitate Shi's powerful mastery of the brush, but favoured rather a distinctive use of line that Lang considers to be reminiscent of the work of one of China's most distinguished modernists, Lin Fang Leone. And on the left here, we see a painting by Lin Fang Leone, and on the right-hand side, Seated Nude, A Study in Black by Noguchi. Lin, who was appointed director of the National Beijing Art College in 1926 and of the National Academy of Art in Hangzhou in 1928, was convinced, I quote, that artists of this new era, 1929, should not confine their views within national boundaries, but, quote, should study the art of all nations with a global perspective, end quote. Lang Xiaojun suggests that the work of Noguchi might have more in common with that of Lin, because, he suggests, both shared a foundation in Western art. Lin himself, who had indeed studied art in Europe, nevertheless made a sharp distinction between Oriental and Western art, especially in the practice of landscape painting. Here's a landscape painting, Untitled Landscape, by Lin. Lin believed that Chinese landscape painters enjoyed more freedom of expression, and unlike Western artists at the time, 1929, were not mechanically, quote, representing the surface of nature, end quote. Here we see Yellow Mountain, a painting of both the detail and the complete painting by another brilliant 20th century Chinese artist, Pan Tianshou, who sought to revitalize and reform Chinese national painting. Pan believed that the materials and modes of representation in Western painting possess what he called unique characteristics, making it meaningful to experiment. He was convinced that Chinese and Western art have different values and that their individual traditions should not be combined or replace one another. Lang Xiaojun provided an insightful analysis of Pan's work. I quote, "His goal is to delineate forms that evoke feelings of being in danger, of going to extremes, of being surprised, of having power, and of thrilling at the sight of something marvelous or even grotesque." Here we see, the labels seem to have gone missing here. Here we see Bald Monk on the left by Pan Tianshou and a Peking drawing by Noguchi on the right from 1930. Another brilliant artist of the period who sought to revitalize and reform the Chinese national painting tradition was the modern literati painter Wang Binghong. Wang, who wrote tracts on the study of ancient painting, the theory and practice of brushwork, and on the history of Western art, stated that he had, quote, no desire to counter the aggression of foreign art. The paintings of both Pan Tianshou and Wang Binghong were included in all exhibitions of contemporary Chinese art in Europe in the 1930s, along with the work of Shi by Shi. Following the 1934 Berlin exhibition, curated by Liu Haisu, a permanent installation of modern Chinese painting was established in the East Asian department of the State Museums in Berlin, with works gifted by the Chinese government from the touring exhibition. Among them were these two paintings by Pan Tianshou on the left and by Wang Binghong on the right. These objects, along with thousands of others, were seized by Russian troops in 1945 and remain to this day in Russia. Here we see on the left China Raw by Li Hua from the woodcut movement and Death, Lynched Figure by Noguchi from 1934. The debate about the true nature of the drawings and sculpture of Noguchi in the 1930s and whether his work is closer in spirit to that of his teacher Shi or to Chinese modernist Lin Fang Leone or even Pan Tian-shou is a fascinating study in how, after a century of cultural exchange between modern China and the West, as Lang Xiaojun points out in his essay to the catalogue to this exhibition, now constitutes an integral part of the history of art. The phenomenon of mutual misreadings. Xu Jiang, president of the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, has suggested that Lin Fang Leone went through, quote, a long period of misreading and an even longer creative process of active misreading and hybridization. It is this that I believe that the Grabbists of the 1930s, Noguchi, Lin, Lu Xun, and the artists of the modern woodcut movement in China share with one another. Their creative misreadings and hybridization, their ease of moving from one artistic vocabulary to another with grace and sophistication, is nowhere clearer than in two sculptural works produced by Noguchi in 1934, Death, Lynch Figure here, and Birth. On his return to the United States from China, Noguchi wrote that he craved other means of communication, to find a way of sculpture that was humanly meaningful without being realistic, at once abstract and socially relevant. The extraordinary Death Lynch Figure was dismissed by Henry McBride in a review of Noguchi's exhibition at the Marie Harriman Galleries in New York. I quote, "The gruesome study of a lynching with a contorted figure dangling from an actual rope as a work of art, it is just a little Japanese mistake," end quote. This mistake was instead an indictment of social injustice, similar in power and intent to one of the iconic works of the modern woodcut movement in China, here China Raw, by the renowned artist Grabbist Li Hua. This much overdue examination of Noguchi's time in Beijing, with all its complexities and unanswered questions, demonstrates indeed how far more complex and unpredictable this period and the rich intellectual and artistic exchanges across cultural boundaries were to be. Thank you very much.